The morning air was heavy and silent. A line of pristine luxury SUVs. A dozen men in sharp black suits. And Jie Chinmei, the most powerful leader in the syndicate, stepped toward his door. It was supposed to be a routine departure. Then, a flash of color broke the gray concrete. A young girl in a bright floral dress sprinted past the perimeter and raised her hand. "Wait! Don't open that car." The guards drew their weapons instantly. They thought she was a distraction. A mistake. But the girl wasn't looking at the guns. She was staring directly at the handle of the boss's door. And what they discovered on that seal would change everything. Because what Ariel or Burbage saw wasn't just a simple threat. It was a high-tech trap designed to end a legacy in a single heartbeat. Jie Chinmei had ruled for decades through calculated fear, but on this morning, his life didn't depend on his army of bodyguards. It depended on a 9-year-old girl who noticed the one thing his elite security ignored. Who was this child? How did she spot a trap set by the city's most dangerous infiltrators? And what happens when a cold-blooded boss realizes the enemy is already inside his inner circle? Stay with me until the end, because this warning from a child was about to unmask a monster hiding in plain sight and ignite a war that would shake the foundations of the underworld. Jie Chinmei moved through the penthouse of his logistics headquarters like a ghost through a machine he had built with his own hands. Every morning was a symphony of precision, conducted in absolute silence. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the sharp, obsidian lines of his tailored suit. To his associates, he was not just a leader, he was a force of nature that demanded order. His world was one of expensive stillness, where a single misplaced folder or a hushed whisper was considered a breach of discipline. In the elevator ride down to the private garage, Chinmei checked his watch, a vintage heirloom that ticked with the same unwavering reliability he expected from his men. He liked things that functioned exactly as they were designed. His power was not rooted in the loud violence of street gangs, but in the quiet control of a man who owned the ports, the roads, and the people who walked them. As the doors slid open, he was met by a phalanx of 10 bodyguards, their faces as impassive as stone. The underground garage was a cathedral of steel and glass, smelling of high-grade gasoline and ozone. 3 black SUVs sat idling, their engines producing a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the concrete floor. This was his sanctuary, the inner sanctum of an empire that spanned the Pacific. Chinmei took a slow, deep breath, adjusting his cuffs. To the outside world, he was the Iron Emperor, a man whose composure was his greatest armor. He stepped toward the lead vehicle, his mind already 3 moves ahead, calculating the variables of the afternoon's meeting. His lead security detail, a man who had served him for a decade, stepped forward to open the heavy, armored door. There was a comfort in this repetition, a sense of security born from 23 years of absolute rule. Chinmei believed his world was impenetrable because he had eliminated every variable, silenced every threat, and perfected every routine. He was a man who saw everything, or so he believed, as he reached for the door handle. He was completely unaware that the very silence he cherished was about to be shattered, and the control he spent a lifetime building was resting on a foundation far more fragile than he could ever have imagined. The heavy silence of the garage was shattered by Ariel's cry, a sound so sharp and unexpected that it bypassed the guard's training and struck a chord of primal alarm. Jie Chinmei remained motionless, his fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch from the cold chrome of the door handle. He didn't turn his head immediately, instead, he watched the reflection of the young girl in the SUV's tinted window. She stood small but defiant, her floral dress a vibrant, chaotic splash of color against the sterile gray concrete. "Move her," the lead guard commanded, his voice a low growl as 2 men stepped forward, their hands resting on the grips of their sidearms. "No," Chinmei said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ariel. He didn't see a child playing a game, he saw a witness. "Speak," he directed, his tone calm but carrying the weight of an ultimatum. Ariel's chest heaved as she struggled for breath, her raised hand trembling but refusing to drop. "I was waiting for my mama," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she looked Chinmay in the eye. "She's the one who cleans the offices. I was sitting behind the big concrete pillar over there, playing with my dolls where no one sees me." She pointed to a dark corner of the garage, a blind spot in the security camera's sweep. Chinmay felt a flicker of irritation, a hole in his perfect fortress. "A man came," Ariel continued, her eyes darting to the SUV. "He didn't look like your men. He wore a gray uniform, but it was too big for him, and he kept looking around like he was scared of the air. He had a silver box, no bigger than a book. He knelt down right where you're standing, Mr. Boss Man. I thought he was fixing the car, but when he opened the box, it made a tiny click hiss sound. He took out a thin, silver wire and tucked it right inside the seal of your door." The guards shifted, their professional composure fracturing into visible unease. Chinmay looked back at the door handle. It looked identical to every other morning. "He saw me," she added, her voice dropping to a terrified tremor. For a second, our eyes met. He looked like a shadow, cold and empty. He told me if I said a word, the car would bite anyone who touched it. Then he disappeared through the service stairs before your men even drove down the ramp." Chinmay looked at his head of security, who was already pale. The Iron Emperor realized in that moment that his sophisticated sensors and armed veterans had been bypassed by a man in a borrowed uniform, all while a child sat in the shadows, watching the invincible empire crumble. Chinmay did not move. He stood like a statue of ice, his eyes fixed on the door handle as his head of security, Kenji, stepped forward with a specialized scanning kit. The air in the garage had grown thick, the hum of the idling SUVs now sounding like a low, predatory growl. The guards had formed a perimeter around Ariel and her mother, who had emerged from the shadows with a look of pure terror. Kenji moved with agonizing slowness. He donned a pair of high-definition tactile gloves and used a magnifying lens equipped with ultraviolet light. As he hovered the light over the chrome handle, a faint, neon blue residue shimmered into view. A substance invisible to the naked eye. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching. "Boss," Kenji whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't touch it. Don't even breathe on it." Using a pair of micro-tweezers, Kenji delicately pulled back the weather stripping of the door seal. There, tucked into the microscopic gap between the handle mechanism and the frame, was a silver wire no thicker than a human hair. It was connected to a small, pressurized vial hidden within the door's interior cavity. "A high-voltage chemical trigger," Kenji explained, his forehead beaded with sweat. "The moment the handle is pulled, the friction completes a circuit. It would have released a concentrated neurotoxin while simultaneously delivering a lethal electrical surge. You wouldn't have even had time to scream." Chinmay felt a coldness settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't a crude pipe bomb or a sniper's bullet. This was surgical. This was sophisticated. "The silver box," Ariel whispered, her small voice cutting through the tension. He put it back in his pocket before he left. Chinmay looked at the door, then at Kenji. "This device," Chinmay said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. "How many people in this city have the clearance to acquire this technology?" Kenji swallowed hard, looking down at the scanner. "It's not from the city, boss. This is proprietary tech from our own logistics R&D branch. Only 3 people have the access codes to remove this from the vault." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The shadow man Ariel saw hadn't just bypassed security, he was part of the security. The Iron Emperor looked around at his loyal phalanx, and for the first time in 23 years, he wondered which of the men holding a gun was waiting for the order to use it on him. The fortress hadn't been breached from the outside. The walls were still standing, but the rot had already reached the throne. Chinmay turned his gaze back to Ariel. The little girl in the floral dress had just unraveled a betrayal that his millions of dollars in surveillance had failed to catch. He realized then that his survival didn't just depend on his power anymore, it depended on the memory of a child. Jie Chinmei stood amidst the swirling tension of the garage, his face a mask of impenetrable bronze. The threat had been identified, but the predator within him knew that the true danger wasn't the wire, it was the hand that had placed it. He raised a single finger, a silent command that brought his security team to an absolute, trembling halt. "Clear the device," Chinmei ordered, his voice a low, melodic silk that betrayed nothing of the fury beneath. "But do it in silence. To the rest of the world, and to the rest of this house, this car is perfectly functional. We leave in 5 minutes, exactly as scheduled." Kenji looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning realization. "Boss? You're still going to use the car?" "I am going to use a car," Chinmei corrected, his gaze sweeping over his men, searching for a flicker of a double take, a bead of sweat that didn't belong, or a breath held too long. "Switch my lead vehicle with the backup. We will proceed with the convoy. If there is a traitor among us, they are currently waiting for a sound that will never come. I want to see their faces when I walk into that meeting alive." It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By maintaining the routine, he was turning his very existence into a weapon of interrogation. He watched as his men scrambled to execute the switch. He paid close attention to Park, his logistics liaison, whose hands seemed to fumble with his phone a second too long. He noted how Lee, his youngest lieutenant, refused to make eye contact with the car, staring instead at the concrete floor with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Chinmei turned back to Ariel and her mother. The girl was watching him with a profound, unblinking clarity. She saw the change in him, the way his composure had sharpened into a lethal edge. He knelt down, the fabric of his expensive suit straining against his frame, and for the first time, he let the Iron Emperor persona slip just enough for her to see the man beneath. "You have done a very brave thing," he said softly. "But the Shadow Man is still here. Until I find him, you and your mother do not leave my sight." He stood up and signaled to his most trusted inner circle. They moved toward the second SUV, the engine still humming their deceptive tune. As Chinmei settled into the leather seat, he didn't look at the road ahead. He looked at the rearview mirror, watching the faces of the men closing the doors. The trap had failed, but the hunt had just begun. He was no longer just a boss departing for a meeting, he was a shark circling a pool of blood, waiting for the first sign of a ripple. The convoy moved with a ghostly smoothness, leaving the underground garage far behind, but the air inside the secondary SUV remained brittle. Jie Chinmei sat in the back, his posture as rigid as the iron for which he was named. Beside him sat Ariel, her small hands folded over her floral dress, and her mother, Elena, whose knuckles were white as she gripped the seat's edge. For the first time in his career, Chinmei was not calculating profit margins or territorial boundaries, he was calculating the weight of a life that owed him nothing, yet had given him everything. He watched the side mirrors, noting the way his security detail scanned every passing motorcycle and every idling van with newfound paranoia. The realization had settled deep in his gut, Ariel was no longer just a witness to a crime, she was the living evidence of a failed coup. The Shadow Man had looked her in the eye. In the world Chinmei inhabited, witnesses were loose threads, and his enemies were experts at pulling them until the entire tapestry unraveled. "You like to draw, don't you?" Chinmei asked, his voice low, breaking the heavy silence. Ariel looked up, surprised by the softness in the boss's tone. "Yes, sir. I draw the birds in the park." "Today, I need you to draw a man," he said, and for a fleeting second, his hand rested near hers, not to touch, but as a silent promise of a barrier. The man with the silver box. Every detail. The way his eyes slanted, the way he held his shoulders. "You are the only one who can see him clearly right now." Elena let out a shaky breath. "Mr. J.E., we just want to go home. We won't say anything to the police, I swear." Chin-mei turned his gaze toward her, his eyes dark and reflecting the passing city lights. If you go home now, you will not make it to the front door. The men who did this do not believe in promises. They only believe in silence. He paused, the cold logic of his world clashing with a burgeoning sense of duty. In my world, a debt is a sacred thing. You saved the head of the JE syndicate. That makes you part of the syndicate's shadow. From this moment on, your home is wherever I am. He signaled to Kenji in the front seat. The destination was no longer the boardroom, it was the nest, a fortified safe house hidden within the city's skyline. As the SUV banked into a sharp turn, Chin-mei realized his debt to this girl had changed him. He was no longer just protecting his throne. He was protecting the only shred of innocence left in his concrete kingdom. The Iron Emperor had found something more valuable than power, a reason to be a shield. Inside the nest, a glass-walled sanctuary perched high above the city's glowing arteries, the air was still and smelled of cedar and old paper. Chin-mei sat across from Ariel at a heavy oak table, watching as she worked with a box of charcoal pencils his men had scavenged from a nearby art supply store. The Iron Emperor had shed his blazer, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He didn't rush her. He knew that memory was a fragile thing, easily shattered by pressure. Ariel leaned over the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scratching of the charcoal was the only sound in the room. Elena stood by the window, her reflection ghost-like against the night sky, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and profound dread. He had a face like everyone else, Ariel whispered, not looking up. But his hands were different. She pushed the paper toward Chin-mei. The sketch was crude but remarkably observant. It wasn't just a face, she had focused on the man's right hand as he reached for the silver box. On the ring finger, she had drawn a thick, jagged band. Chin-mei took the drawing, his eyes narrowing. A ring? No, Ariel said, shaking her head. It wasn't a ring you can take off. It was a mark. Like a snake biting its own tail, but it was made of blue ink and bumpy skin. Chin-mei felt a surge of adrenaline that was colder than the mountain air. He knew that mark. It wasn't a tattoo from a street gang or a prison block. It was an Ouroboros, a symbol used by a very specific, elite tier of private military contractors, men he had personally hired 3 years ago to oversee the Ghost Protocol for his logistics fleet. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He signaled to Kenji, who was standing by the door. Bring me the personnel files for the Internal Security Division. Specifically, the veterans from the 4th Quadrant. Boss? Kenji asked, his voice low. The girl didn't see a maintenance man, Chin-mei said, his voice a dangerous, low vibration. She saw a technician. Someone who knows our encryption because he helped write it. He looked at the sketch again. The shadow man was no longer a ghost. He was one of the men who stood in the shadows of Chin-mei's own hallways every day. The Ouroboros signified an operative who answered only to the highest bidder, and in this case, the bidder was Hansung. The unmasking was complete. The traitor wasn't just in the house, he was a pillar of it. Chin-mei turned to Ariel, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. You've given me his name without even knowing it, little one. The air in the boardroom was frigid, the scent of expensive cologne and ozone clinging to the atmosphere like a shroud. Chin-mei sat at the head of the obsidian table, his hands folded in front of him in a posture of deceptive serenity. Around him sat his most senior lieutenants and the elite security technicians of the Internal Security Division. Among them was Hansung's shadow, a man named Guan, whose right hand remained partially obscured beneath the table's edge. Chin-mei did not begin with accusations. Instead, he smiled, a rare and unsettling expression that didn't reach his eyes. Today was supposed to be my final morning, he began, his voice a low, melodic vibration. A sophisticated device was planted on my vehicle. A chemical trigger, proprietary technology. It was a masterpiece of infiltration. The room remained deathly silent. Chinmay turned his gaze toward Guan. I wanted to bring you all here to offer a reward. Because while the attempt failed, the execution was flawless. It proved that my own security protocols are the best in the world. So, I have decided to promote the man responsible for the test. Guan's composure didn't break, but his fingers twitched, a microscopic movement that Ariel had described perfectly. I've already sent a specialized bonus to the technician's private account, Chinmay continued, leaning forward. The account associated with the Ouroboros mark. It's a shame, Guan. You were so careful with the cameras, but you forgot that children don't look at the sky, they look at the ground. The silence shattered. Guan's hand moved toward his jacket, but he was a second too slow. The Iron Emperor didn't even flinch as Kenji and 3 other guards pinned Guan to the table. In the struggle, Guan's sleeve pushed back, revealing the bumpy, blue ink snake biting its own tail, the mark of the traitor. Hansung promised you a seat at this table, Chinmay whispered, standing over him. But you're sitting at it now. How does it feel? Guan spat on the obsidian surface, his face contorting. You're a relic, Chinmay. The takeover has already started. The ports, the warehouses, they don't answer to a ghost anymore. Chinmay leaned down, his voice dropping to a terrifying chill. They answer to the man who is still breathing. You thought I was blind because I was at the top. But a little girl reminded me that the most important details are often the ones we step over. He straightened his cuffs, the trap fully sprung. The meeting wasn't just to catch a killer, it was to signal to every man in the room that the Emperor's eyes were now everywhere. The news of Guan's capture rippled through the city's concrete arteries faster than a fever. In the high-rise offices of Hansung, the air was thick with the suffocating realization that the coup had stalled before it could even begin. Hansung had gambled everything on a silent assassination and a quick takeover, believing that Chinmay was a relic who would go quietly into the night. He had not accounted for the Iron Emperor's ability to turn a failed trap into a psychological siege. Chinmay did not send a hit squad to Hansung's door. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He released the digital signatures Guan had used to access the Ghost Protocol. By leaking the evidence of Hansung's internal sabotage to the other syndicate heads, Chinmay stripped his rival of all political leverage. In the underworld, a man who tries to kill a boss is feared, but a man who breaks the sacred codes of logistics and internal trust is a liability to everyone's profit. By sunset, the ports that Hansung thought he had secured were silent. The captains who had been wavering in their loyalty returned to the syndicate, not because of threats, but because Chinmay had shown them he could survive the impossible. He had displayed a clarity of mind that made Hansung look desperate and sloppy. Hansung was found 2 hours later, sitting alone in a darkened warehouse at the edge of the harbor. He didn't fight when Chinmay's men arrived. He knew the rules. When Chinmay stepped out of the shadow of a parked SUV, he didn't look like a man seeking vengeance. He looked like a judge. You focused on the machine, Chinmay said, his voice carrying over the sound of the lapping tide. You spent millions on technicians and chemical triggers. But you forgot that the city is made of people, Hansung. Even the ones you think are invisible. Hansung looked up, his face pale and hollow. A child, Chinmay. You were saved by a child. I was saved by the truth, Chinmay replied. He didn't order an execution. Instead, he signaled for his men to take Hansung into custody to face the Council of Elders. By choosing the law of the syndicate over the impulse of the gun, Chinmay restored the order that had been fracturing for years. His wisdom had achieved what brute force never could. He hadn't just defeated a rival, he had made himself indispensable. As he walked away from the warehouse, the Iron Emperor felt the weight of the crown settle back onto his head, sturdier and more absolute than ever before. The dust of the failed coup settled, but the silence that followed in Chinmay's penthouse was different now. It was no longer the cold, sterile silence of a fortress, but a quiet moment of reflection. Chinmay stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. In his hand, he held a simple piece of paper, not a contract or a hit list, but a legal trust document embossed with the seal of his most prestigious private bank. The Iron Emperor had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but a 9-year-old girl in a floral dress had walked through them without a single weapon. He looked down at the document, which ensured that Ariel or Burbage would never have to sit in a dark corner of a garage again. It provided for a home in the safest district of the city, a lifetime of the finest education, and a future far removed from the shadows of men like him. He walked to the guest suite where Ariel and Elena were preparing to leave. The girl was sitting on the edge of a velvet chair, her charcoal pencils tucked neatly into a new wooden case Chinmay had gifted her. When he entered, Elena stood quickly, the old habit of fear still lingering in her eyes, but Chinmay raised a hand. Not in a command, but in a gesture of peace. "The debt is settled," he said, his voice a low, steady hum. He handed the envelope to Elena. "This is not a gift. It is a repayment. In my world, we are taught that power is everything. But you reminded me that power is blind if it cannot see the smallest among us." Ariel stood up and walked over to him. She didn't see the feared boss of the JE syndicate, she saw the man she had saved. She reached out and touched his hand. The same hand that had ordered the dismantling of empires. "Will you be okay, Mr. Boss Man?" she asked softly. Chinmay looked at her, and for a brief, fleeting second, a genuine smile touched his lips. "I will be more careful where I step," he replied. As they were escorted to a waiting car, one that had been checked and double-checked by a now fanatical security detail, Chinmay watched them go. He knew that to his enemies, he would always be a monster, a predator who ruled with an iron fist. But as the car disappeared into the night, he felt a strange, new weight in his chest. He had honored the innocence that saved him, proving that even a heart of iron can recognize the value of a single, brave voice. The war was over, the traitor was gone, and for the first time in 23 years, Chinmay felt truly invincible, not because of his guns, but because he had finally paid the only debt that truly mattered.